Hello, my name is Aaron Green. Welcome to my studio, the Spanish Guitar Workshop. I am here today with actually a few guitars that I'm very excited to talk to you about, but first is the one that I have in my hand, which is a 1947 Hermann Hauser Yobet model. I had recently represented this guitar for sale and was really eager to do a video about it specifically, and as I was doing the video, it really occurred to me that perhaps it would be more interesting to people to talk not only about this instrument, but the other guitars that I have in stock by Hermann Hauser and also his son Hermann Hauser II. So I will give you a quick introduction, and I'm going to pick them up and just talk about the instruments and do a little compare and contrast relative to design aspects, as they represent a fairly nice evolution in Hauser's work within the Spanish guitar. We'll start over here at my bench. This is actually a guitar I've been familiar with for quite some time. This is a 1941 Segovia model. This actually is an instrument that was the first Hauser I ever represented as a dealer, and also the first one that I ever restored along with Karl Franks as a restorationist. This is an instrument that, from a lot of its sonic qualities as well as some of its construction qualities, is very similar to the 1940 Augustine Hauser, which is what Julian Bream used for the end of his career, as certainly as a concert artist. I heard him on that instrument in 1996, and it was still to this date one of the most amazing guitar experiences I've ever had. So we'll talk about this in a minute, but moving along, I have here the oldest Hauser I've ever represented. This is a 1928 ex-Celedonio Romero. So this instrument was owned by the great Celedonio Romero. I acquired it from his son Pepe, who's obviously one of the great virtuosos of the instrument. This instrument actually predates, as far as I can tell, the Segovia or Yobet designation, in the sense that it doesn't really conform with either of them, and probably represents one of the earliest examples of Hauser's work within the Spanish model. I had my hands on one when I was in Paris from 1924 that was a very interesting combination of both the European and the Spanish guitar making tradition. So it's kind of a transitional instrument, if you will. This is definitely 100% a Spanish guitar. And in fact, I would say sonically is the most Spanish sounding I've ever seen out of Hauser. It kind of reminds me most of a Santos Hernandez, which of course was a great source of inspiration for Hauser as he explored the Spanish design. Now, over here, I have a 1936 Segovia model. So the famous Segovia Hauser is from 1937. That isn't actually the first Hauser that he owned, although it is the one that he referred to as the greatest guitar of our epoch. So this predates that guitar by a year or so. Its design is very similar in some sense. It's also somewhat unique in some sense based on other Hausers that I have handled. And it shows as a builder, he was always really kind of striving for his ideal, and also working with the materials that he had and making decisions based on those two things, which is how a builder is supposed to operate. This is in magnificent condition. It is an absolutely stellar instrument. Now, I do have coming up soon a 1936 Yobet model, which is a wonderful companion to this instrument. They're actually, in a lot of ways, very similar, which is kind of interesting based on some of the design differences on the 47 Yobet model, which we'll also talk a little bit more about. this is a 1953 Hauser II. Hermann Hauser passed away in 1952. I actually had, years ago in my possession, a 52 Hauser that was considered, if it wasn't the last, it was among the very last, that he built. And it came with some letters, one of which was from Hauser Sr. to the person he was building the guitar for. And it said, "Your guitar is done. I'm going away on a holiday, and when I get back, I'll ship you your new instrument." And then the next letter that I saw in that particular collection of letters was from Hauser II. Basically said, "My dad passed away. I have your guitar. I'll be shipping you the instrument, and I'm going to continue the workshop and be a guitar maker following his example." So this would be, if not the first out of him that did so, it's definitely one of them. The interesting thing about Hauser II is he followed his father very closely at first, and then, as builders do, evolved his own ideas within a very, tight radius, if you will, of the Hauser attributes. This is, again, how it's supposed to be. But this particular instrument is the closest I've seen to one of his dad's in terms of the design on the interior. It is basically identical to the 1952 that I remember. One thing that you can see, of course, in the camera here is that the top of this instrument is utterly spectacular. This is hazelficht, as we say. That's the word for the figure, otherwise known as bear claw. Very interesting component. As a means of contrast is you have here, again, the 47 Yobet, and I don't know if you can pick up on that, but the materials are the same. This is the same wood. I think that the guitar's plantilla, the shape of the guitars, are cut in different orientation to the figuring in the wood, but it is absolutely the same material, which kind of leads me to an interesting point relative to the Hauser mythology. I'm going to put this guy down and talk a little bit about that. So early in my career, and this would be in the early to mid 90s, an article came out in the Guild of American Luthiers magazine. It was an interview conducted by Richard Brunet. And it was an interview with a gentleman named Hart Huddig, who was, he was a wood dealer, he was a world traveler, he was a great aficionado of the guitar. He was someone I really wish I could have met. He had passed away at that point, and this was an interview that Richard had conducted a few years prior. Among all the stories in the interview that he told, one of them struck me as being kind of amazing, which was about Hauser, and it had to do specifically with Hauser immediately following World War II. So I think one thing that's important to remember about the work of Hermann Hauser is that he actually lived through 2 world wars. So there appears to me anyways to be some holes in his production which are all too understandable. But in this particular story, he talked about how Hauser had left Munich and had moved out to the country, and ostensibly the story was that his workshop had been destroyed, which turned out later to not be exactly the case, thankfully. But that there was an important American with connections, and believe in the interview he said like a general or something, who specifically wanted some guitars from Hauser. So Hauser's at his place, and a convoy of American soldiers show up and tell him he needs to build some guitars, to which his response was, "I'd love to, but I don't have anything to build guitars with." And then apparently the next day these convoys of materials showed up and he got to work building these instruments. So this was an apocryphal story, and I remember reading it and thinking, how wonderful as a builder it would be to have someone show up and just dump, truckloads of materials off with you. It was in 2001, so a few years after that, 2 instruments came up for sale at Christie's in New York City, and they were, in fact, 2 Hauser guitars that had been built for an American with important connections. So this actually did substantiate this story. These are the instruments that he was talking about, and in fact they came with a tremendous amount of letters, which I have here. I can show you the scope of them is just amazing. Between Hauser and the gentleman that he built the guitar for, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Cecil. So these letters start out with Dr. Cecil hearing Segovia in concert and deciding he wants one of his, wants the same guitar. So he writes to the Segovia Society, says, I'd love to know what the maestro's playing because I would like one for myself. Sophocles Pappas, who is the president of the society, wrote back and said that it's a Hauser, and we're not really quite sure when we'll be seeing more of them, and hopefully we will, and we'll let you know. So Dr. Cecil used his connections in the American military and wrote to a gentleman overseas by the name of Thomas Gamble, who was also a doctor, and asked him to go find Hauser, which he did. He located him outside of Munich in the town called Reisbach-Wils. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. That's where the Hauser family resides to this day. And so that is how these letters kind of started off with, we've located him, he'd be happy to build you a guitar, but he needs to go to Italy and get spruce for the instrument. It'll push delivery back by, I think he said 2 months or something to that degree. And that is what began their correspondence, because this gentleman was trading goods for the instrument. Money didn't really have a whole lot of value in post-war Germany, or at least immediately post-war Germany. So they needed things like medicine and socks and cigarettes, stuff like that. So he kind of struck a deal with Hauser and started supplying these goods in exchange for the guitar that he got, which was a Segovia model. Also 1947. So no sooner did he get his Segovia model, he plays it, he loves it, he decides he wants to order another guitar, and that's where this instrument comes in. Now, this instrument is what Hauser in the letters refers to as his Spanish model. This is the Yobet model based on Miguel Yobet's Torres. In terms of how it relates to the Segovia model, it's a smaller instrument. It's about 1 centimeter narrower and about 1.5 centimeters shorter along the length of its body. It has a shorter scale length. It's also this is a 640 as opposed to a 650. One thing that I adore about this specific guitar is how he adjusted the proportions of other components of the instrument, such as the bridge, to fit the smaller plantilla. This isn't something that he always did. In fact, the 1936 Yobet that I have has a bridge that's exactly the same size as the 1936 Segovia model. However, when I first got my hands on this guitar, I remember looking at it thinking, boy, that really doesn't look like a guitar that was made out of brand new wood. And so I was kind of confounded by that. The instrument first came into my world in 2001 when its owner actually purchased it from Christie's. He contacted my dear friend Dennis Koster, asked him to come and play the guitar for him so he could hear it. And Dennis did, and then told me about it. And then this gentleman became a student of Dennis's, and in fact, actually a client of mine. But this instrument I got my hands on, I was like 27 or so quite a young maker, and it inspired me tremendously. In fact, so much that I created my own Yobet-inspired model from getting my hands on this instrument, and how much, it just kind of blew my mind. But anyways, as I was talking about the spruce, it really didn't look like it was made out of new wood. So I didn't quite know what to make of that. I then get my hands on recently on the 53, and I note that it has, the same top wood. What happened then right after that was a really fortuitous communication with a great maker in Germany named Gerhard Oldegas. He's a wonderful master builder, and he contacted me with a picture of a 1940 Hauser that, once again, had the same exact top. So this was material that was obviously very dear to Hauser, and something he probably was a little loath to part with on the first contact with an amateur client in the United States. And he decided that he needed more wood anyways. He would use that for that Segovia model. By the time the Yobet model was built, they had become quite friendly with each other, and Dr. Cecil had commissioned that guitar for his daughter. And so this was, I think, the reason that Hauser decided he was going to, pull out the really, really top-notch stuff and use it for this particular instrument. And I have to say, of all the Hausers I've had in my possession, this one is definitely sitting up at the very top in terms of its character and its projection and its concert quality, it's a guitar that I love very much. So happy that it is going to a very good friend and client of mine. One of the things that I love about Hauser aesthetics, and also it speaks to my heart as a builder, is the way that he would often use the materials to show off the natural beauty of the materials. And one of the things that he did regularly, and it's actually, you can see in a couple of the guitars here, is, let me try and get it so the camera can pick up on this. The heel is a darker mahogany than the neck. And it gives a really beautiful contrast, and it highlights this joint, which I can tell you as a builder, to get that to look really, really slick, it takes some effort. It's not, you know, if you want it to look good, you're going to have to spend some time. You've got a lot of, you know, meeting of different curves, and it's definitely a good point of workmanship. One of the things I also love about Hauser is his practicality. Now, try and get this so you can see it. Let's see here. I don't know how well that's picking up, but the V joint, this is a great testament to his skill as a carver, but at the very tip of it, there's an obvious joint across the V part of the V joint, and it is another piece of wood that he glued on to make up the appropriate thickness. Now, if you look, you can see that the headstock is back at an angle, so the neck piece of wood to include the material for that would have to be a bit thicker. So either the material he had wasn't, or he decided it would be wasteful to cut necks at that thickness, you know, or thicker than he needed them to be, simply to make up for that little tiny part. And as such, he then just glued a piece on there and did so beautifully. It's an excellent joint. It's visible, but it says to me that his practicality was such that he wanted to make sure that, you know, the right piece of wood was used regardless of whether or not he would have to, you know, modify it to make it work. This is the 28 I was telling you about just a few moments ago. This guitar was, at one point in the 70s, restored by Hermann Hauser II, extensively restored, and masterfully restored as well. However, when it came to me, the repairs had let go a little bit, and just generally they needed to be redone, which is totally, this is common in the world of restoring instruments. One of the things that I noticed immediately was its incredible vibrancy for a guitar that's almost 100 years old. It's so alive, and it really, as I like to say, likes being a guitar. It's super responsive. It has an incredible depth to its voice. It's got incredible complexity, and it's also very beautiful. The instrument's made out of Indian rosewood, which is a material that he used quite regularly, as well as Brazilian, and shows a lot of Torres influences. This rosette is straight up Torres. So the headstock crest is of interest because it is a different and earlier design than the three-lobe Torres design we're more used to seeing with Hauser. The 1931 that I had, that had belonged to my dear friend Frank Wallace, also had this same crest, but that was the last, or the latest instrument, I should say, that I have seen that had that particular crest. There may very well be ones out there, but it's a really beautiful carving, and you know, I think aesthetically it stands shoulder to shoulder with the headstock crest we're a little more used to seeing. Chronologically, I'll move up to the 36 Segovia model here. Now this instrument, I'll tell you a funny story, well, a great story. It's not funny at all. It's one that really had a lot of impact on my direction as a builder, or my continuing direction is a little more accurate to say. In early 2020, I had this guitar in my hands and I was in New York City, and I met up with Javier Jara, who's a wonderful virtuoso, one of the great young American guitarists out there. And he's a player who I really admire quite a lot for his musicality. He's obviously technically brilliant, but he's also has a tremendous musicality as a player, which comes across and is something that I always love to hear in a player. I loaned him this instrument for a concert. He actually was playing with the rest of the San Francisco Conservatory staff. They were doing a kind of an expose for potential students in New York City, and he apparently didn't know he was going to be playing because he didn't have a guitar. So I was showing him this guitar, and he asked if he could borrow it, and I said absolutely. Now what happened was a wonderful example of the real powers of the traditional classical guitar in the hands of someone who actually wants to explore these things. Everyone who played that night was magnificent. They are all masterful players, great virtuoso. They were all playing modern guitars. And when he came out, Javier, at the end and performed, the difference in terms of complexity and color and projection and musicality was undeniable. He just absolutely captivated the place, and this instrument is what allowed him to do so, in my opinion anyways. Not to take anything away from him. But it was as remarkable as the scene in The Wizard of Oz where it goes from black and white to color. It was, you could not deny it. And the volume disparity was not what you would expect on the listener's side. I mean, it definitely was not the same kind of horsepower, if you will, but it was a projecting and penetrating, if you will, kind of sound that really was absolutely magical. So that really made me feel better as someone who has always felt that the traditional guitar really was perfect in its inception, that there wasn't something that needed to be fixed about it, certainly from a volume perspective. So, okay, now, this is an old friend of mine. This instrument came to me to represent in 2010, I think, somewhere around there. And when I got it, it had a lot of very, let's just say, poorly executed repairs that really needed to be addressed. It had been sold to the owner in that condition, and when I agreed to represent it, I said that I would do so, but I didn't feel comfortable selling it in that condition. I would have to represent it along with the restoration to go to bring it up to where it needed to be. Thankfully, I have an amazing restoration partner named Karl Franks, who comes from the violin world. He is a microsurgeon and can do things that I've never seen anyone else achieve in that kind of work. So I felt comfortable taking this on between the two of us, having the skill sets that we needed to do so. The thing about the sound of this instrument that was so captivating to me is its incredible depth and vitality. It's a tremendously beautiful sounding guitar, even in its condition back then. It also has what I was saying about the feature with the heel here, being a darker mahogany than the neck shaft. And this one does also have that little tiny graft at the end. So it seems to me that this was something he did quite regularly. Also Indian rosewood, and really magnificent Indian. One thing about this that you can't tell from the video is that it is an absolute feather. I love the weight of this guitar. In the restoration work that we did, we took the fingerboard off because the fingerboard was dead, and it allowed us to get at the wood that was underneath there. So when we redid the splints in the top, we were using actually original wood, which is kind of amazing to me. It means also that the guitar is more original post-restoration than it was pre-restoration, which is not the usual way that these things go. This was all work that we did literally 12 years ago. It's in amazing condition. It's relative to having been this heavily restored, and it's just one of my nearest and dearest when it comes to these guitars. I have a lot of fond memories of working on this instrument. now we have this magnificent 1953. Also Indian rosewood. This is an instrument that came to me pretty recently. I had never, seen one this early. Pretty much every Hauser II that I've had has been from 1959, which is kind of odd in and of itself. It was a very good year for Hauser, I must say. This one has a little bit more of the dad in it, and I think the adherence to his design has something to do with that, as well as the fact that Hauser II was working in his dad's workshop, helping his father build his instruments. So I think at this point when he built this guitar, he was very much still working to the ideals and direction of his father, and he did so magnificently. This is a very colorful instrument. It's got a lot of sustain and just it's a magnificent guitar. His workmanship is absolutely exquisite, much like his father's. And it was a real nice thing to come across, to see something this close to the very beginning of his career and to also start off so well. So I'm very, very happy to have it, and I'm really looking forward to helping it find its next home. I hope that you enjoyed this video. I'm definitely planning on doing more. I kind of like the idea of keeping things a little more informal when I am doing these. The scholarly work of other people such as Richard Brunet and specifically to Hauser Michael Hermann is a wonderful addition to our understanding of these instruments, but that's not necessarily quite what I wanted to talk about today. If anyone has any questions or suggestions for future videos, I'd be really happy to hear from you. I definitely appreciate you watching, and thank you very much.